Imagine inventing something so terrifying that within just a few years, nations across the globe agreed. Absolutely not. That's the story of the Dum Dum Bullet. Important note, the 1899 Prohibition only applied to wars between states that signed the Declaration. Police and civilian use today fall under a completely different legal framework. Born in India, banned at the Hague, and still debated in military ethics classrooms. It's a weapon whose reputation has lasted longer than the empire that built it. And yet, bullets with a strikingly similar design are standard issue for police in 2025. The key lies in both the technical resemblance and the legal distinction, a difference this story will unpack step by step. But before that, there's one odd detail about these bullets that people notice first: their name. The arsenal with the candy name. The story begins with an arsenal in British India, an ordinary supply depot that would eventually lend its name to one of the most infamous munitions in modern history. Known as the Dum Dum Arsenal, situated near Kolkata, it became the site where British military engineers tried to solve a pressing problem with the new .303 rifle cartridge. And while versions of expanding ammunition already existed, in hunting rifles and in older soft-lead bullets that deformed on impact, the Dum Dum adaptation was specific, a modified form of the full metal jacket service round designed for colonial campaigns. Its place of origin gave it a name that would carry far beyond the factory grounds, permanently attaching a disarmingly innocent label to a profoundly brutal weapon. The arsenal at Dum Dum had been a large-scale industrial hub of empire, producing cartridges, rifles, and everything Britain needed to arm its forces across the subcontinent. By the late 1800s, it was under huge pressure to meet military demands as the empire shifted towards small-caliber, high-velocity ammunition. On paper, these new rounds looked effective, fast, aerodynamic, and accurate at long range. But reports from the field soon revealed something troubling. The bullets were piercing enemies cleanly, leaving slim wounds that often didn't disable their targets right away. An opponent could be struck multiple times yet still keep advancing, a problem officers described with growing alarm. The rounds might have been admired in engineering reports, but on campaign their usefulness seemed uncertain at best and dangerous at worst. This was not a trivial issue for soldiers on the ground. In colonial theaters from Africa to Asia, firefights often happened at close quarters against fighters who were determined and highly mobile. When a bullet zipped through without producing instant results, it left British troops vulnerable. What the army wanted was not just precision, it wanted what soldiers soon began calling stopping power, the ability to end a charge in an instant. The Dum Dum arsenal became the place where that demand was taken seriously, and where a practical, if grim, solution was put into motion. The adjustments made there were not complicated. Captain Neville Clay, one of the ordnance officers at the factory, oversaw experiments on the .303 cartridge then in service. The standard version was a full metal jacket round designed to maintain its shape at high speed. Clay and his colleagues altered this design by cutting away or thinning the tip of the jacket, exposing the soft lead core underneath. The change was small, but its consequences were dramatic. On impact, the nose of the bullet no longer remained sleek. Instead, the lead spread out or mushroomed, carving a much wider wound channel than the narrow puncture left by the original. A soldier firing this round saw the effect immediately. An enemy once able to rush forward despite hits could now be stopped cold. Descriptions from observers often skipped the medical detail and focused squarely on outcomes. Where earlier bullets slipped through a body leaving an opponent disturbingly capable of fighting back, the Dum Dum variant shattered tissue and bone to such an extent that continuing the charge became impossible. For officers in the field, this was the solution they had been demanding. A rifleman armed with the new expanding rounds could fire fewer shots, but expect decisive result. The battlefield dynamic shifted, but so too did the moral and political questions surrounding this innovation. The curious part was how casually destructive power carried such a frivolous name. Dum Dum Bullet sounded, to English ears, like something pulled from a nursery rhyme. Soldiers used it informally at first, with little sense that the nickname itself might one day eclipse the technical designations like Mark Roman II** or Mark IV. Colonial administrators requested shipments of Dum Dums, as if the word referred to nothing more serious than a standardized bit of equipment. Yet behind the euphemistic language were battlefield injuries of shocking severity. Accounts told of massive wounds emergency amputations, and opponents incapacitated in ways far more catastrophic than before. The childlike sound of the name served only to highlight the grim mismatch between word and effect. It is important to remember that Dum Dum's expanding rounds were not the first of their kind. Hunters had long relied on hollow point and soft-lead bullets to stop large game, and earlier designs like the Mini-A ball deformed significantly on impact. What made Dum Dum different was its place within the official supply chain of an imperial army, a sanctioned modification brought into service not for sport, but as an organized response to battlefield conditions. That institutional backing gave the bullet legitimacy in the eyes of commanders, and later, notoriety in the eyes of critics. The broader context reveals an uncomfortable truth about how empires operated. The design produced at Dum Dum was not simply technical problem-solving, it was a weapon tailored for colonial control. Against populations viewed as needing firm suppression, British forces demanded ammunition capable of asserting overwhelming force quickly and visibly. The expanding bullet delivered exactly that. For the men firing it, the reassurance was tangible. For those struck by it, the consequence was a level of injury often beyond recovery. In that balance of needs and outcomes, Dum Dum became an emblem of the raw violence that underpinned imperial expansion. Over time, the arsenal itself faded from memory, but the name endured. Dum Dum came to mean any expanding bullet, whether or not it had been made at Kolkata. Journalists, diplomats, and soldiers all adopted the term until it signified not a factory but a category of brutality. Reports from battle fronts spread beyond military circles into public commentary, where critics seized on the phrase as evidence of warfare that had crossed into unacceptable territory. What began as a technical fix at a single arsenal had transformed into the symbol of a global debate over the limits of allowable violence. One final irony made the term unforgettable. Had the experiment been conducted at Enfield or Woolwich, the resulting ammunition might have been known by a bland ordnance designation. Instead, it bore a name that sounded more like confectionery than weaponry. The contrast between sound and substance fixed the idea in public imagination. By the late 1890s, Dum Dum had become shorthand for cruelty on the battlefield, a word that carried not just technical meaning but moral weight. It was instantly recognizable, lingering in discussions of military ethics long after the Colonial depot itself had lost its relevance. For the engineers who first tried the modification, none of this was their intention. Their task had been straightforward: make sure the .303 round could bring down an adversary swiftly and reliably. But in solving that immediate problem, they had sparked a controversy that would ripple far beyond their workshop. To Britain's army, it offered a fix. To the outside world, it represented a disturbing example of technology surpassing the boundaries of acceptable use. The next stage of the story would not be centered on the arsenal, but on the battlefield problem itself. What commanders really meant when they spoke obsessively of stopping power, and why the Dum Dum was seen as its answer. Stopping power and the battlefield problem. When the British Army adopted smaller, high-velocity rifle rounds in the late 19th century, the change was hailed as modernization. These cartridges were flatter in trajectory, more precise over long distances, and easier to mass-produce than the old lead balls. But the apparent advantage quickly revealed a serious drawback. Reports from the field described enemies being struck cleanly yet continuing to advance, sometimes even after several hits. For soldiers in remote garrisons, watching opponents close the gap despite well-aimed fire was unnerving. The technical cause was not mysterious. The new bullets were encased in a copper or brass shell, the full metal jacket. This jacket was introduced for a reason. Smokeless powder, far hotter and more corrosive than black powder, had been destroying lead bullets and fouling barrels. The jacket solved that problem, allowing high-speed firing without ruining rifles. But the same feature that kept the bore clean also kept the round intact after impact. Instead of fragmenting or deforming like soft lead, the bullet passed straight through the body while holding its shape, leaving wounds that looked deceptively small. In practice, this meant a chest shot might fail to stop a charge if it missed the heart or spine by even a narrow margin. One vivid example appeared again and again in memories of British frontier campaigns. Soldiers firing their new Lee Metford rifles at fast-moving opponents would see men falter only slightly, then continue forward with blades or rifles raised. To the troops themselves, the marksmanship was not in question. The weapon was simply failing its most important test. In a close fight, a bullet that pierced cleanly without halting the advance was worse than useless. It was a hazard to the shooter relying on it. Commanders framed this problem in a new vocabulary. They spoke not of accuracy, but of stopping power, meaning a round's ability to halt a person on the spot. Older soft-lead ammunition performed this function naturally, since it crushed and deformed inside the body. By contrast, the full metal jacket worked too well in preserving its streamlined form. From Sudan to the northwest frontier, reports from Chitral, Malakand, and later Omdurman repeated the complaint. The .303 service round produced neat holes, but not enough shock to incapacitate at once. For officers who measured survival by whether a single shot could halt a charge, this was a bitter irony. To understand why this priority weighed so heavily, consider the math of small colonial units. A handful of British riflemen holding a defensive position might face dozens of attackers rushing across open ground. Ammunition was limited, reloads took time, and reinforcements might be miles away. If each bullet disabled a man immediately, that handful of riflemen could hold their line. But when bullets passed through without knocking men down, the attackers could still press forward, sometimes reaching bayonet range. In such environments, what the army demanded was not just accuracy, but certainty. At Dum Dum Arsenal, engineers were tasked with solving that dilemma. The modifications they introduced were straightforward but decisive. By trimming back the forward part of the copper jacket or leaving the nose unjacketed altogether, they exposed the softer lead core inside. When this round struck flesh, the lead expanded outward, increasing its diameter and tearing a much broader path. Instead of slipping cleanly through, it crushed tissue and splintered bone. In plain terms, the bullet was designed to deform, and in doing so it delivered the immediate collapse commanders had been asking for. Field reports soon confirmed the change in effect. Where soldiers once worried at the sight of opponents pressing on despite multiple hits, they now saw enemies drop after a single shot. To British officers, this felt like vindication. The rifle's full potential had been unlocked. To those struck, it meant catastrophic injuries even from hits to limbs. A wound no longer looked like a small puncture. Instead, it resembled torn meat, with damage so extensive that survival often required amputation, if survival was possible at all. What had been sold as a correction to a design flaw came at the cost of injuries so severe they unnerved even experienced observers. On the battlefield, the difference was blunt and unmistakable. Troops armed with standard jacketed rounds sometimes risked being overrun by men who stayed on their feet after several hits. With dum-dums, the charge could be broken by fewer shots. In terms of tactical advantage, the choice seemed self-evident, but the very efficiency of this ammunition gave rise to unease. Unlike the tidy wounds of the earlier .303, which surgeons might patch with stitching or bandaging, these new injuries were devastating by default. Even minor hits destroyed limbs beyond repair. For British officers, the answer to the question of whether the bullets were acceptable was straightforward. They worked, and therefore they were necessary. Effectiveness carried greater weight than humanitarian concern. Yet soldiers returning from campaigns wrote about what they had witnessed, from bodies struck down instantly to wounds so graphic they barely resembled what medical staff had prepared for. These stories spread until the Dum Dum Bullet was known not just as a solution to a tactical issue, but as a symbol of excessive violence, a round designed to guarantee destruction beyond what many considered tolerable. That tension, the demand for certainty in combat, and the horror of the results, was not something the engineers at Dum Dum could resolve. Their bullets answered the Army's plea for stopping power, but they also left behind scenes that created new doubts about how far technology should go. Those doubts did not surface in parliamentary debates or military memoranda alone. They were inscribed in the bodies treated by field surgeons, who suddenly confronted wounds that bore little resemblance to those they had been trained for. And it was in those medical tents and hospitals that the full consequences became visible, revealing the true costs of these expanding rounds in ways no tactical report could prepare for. Battlefield shockwaves. On the battlefield, the first encounters with dum-dum wounds struck both soldiers and doctors with a kind of disbelief. Earlier forms of ammunition had left injuries that were painful and dangerous, but at least carried the possibility of treatment. A round musket ball or a standard full metal jacket might fracture a bone or pierce an organ, yet surgeons recognized the patterns and had established methods, cleaning, stitching, and setting breaks. With dum-dums, that sense of familiarity collapsed. The damage exceeded anything doctors of the 19th century had prepared for. Wounds often appeared as gaping cavities rather than linear tracks, and in many cases the destruction was so extensive that survival hinged on immediate amputation. What made these bullets so disruptive was the way they behaved upon impact. The exposed lead at the tip caused the bullet to deform the moment it hit resistance. Instead of passing forward smoothly, the nose flattened outward, pushing tissue violently aside. Each millimeter of widening increased the trauma, carving misshapen channels and leaving behind jagged wounds. A thigh or arm hit squarely could look as though it had been torn apart rather than pierced, with surgeons reporting shattered long bones that broke into sharp splinters. Compared with the cleaner punctures of traditional ammunition, the difference was obvious to anyone who saw it, and horrifying for those tasked with treatment. Medical reports from campaigns of the 1890s, especially those compiled by field surgeons at Omdurman in Sudan, drew particular attention. Their notes described shattered femurs, pulverized shoulders, and exit wounds that appeared several times larger than the entry point. Many of these cases ended in amputation right on the operating table, not as a last resort, but as the only avenue for survival. For doctors who had grown accustomed to cleaner bullet wounds, even in crude battlefield conditions, dum-dums seemed less like conventional ammunition and more like instruments designed to maximize destruction. The psychological effect spread quickly beyond operating tents. Soldiers who heard accounts of these wounds or who saw comrades coming back disfigured began to fear not only death but the likelihood of mutilation. Being struck no longer meant a chance at recovery. It often meant permanent disability even if one lived. Within ranks, the mere rumor that opposing forces used expanding bullets raised dread, making the weapon infamous long before official debates began. For commanders, such results demonstrated the sought-after stopping power. For surgeons and soldiers, the same results embodied an entirely new scale of cruelty. Even hardened military doctors, accustomed to grim scenes, admitted they had never confronted injuries quite like these. Setting bones became pointless when what remained were shards beyond reconstruction. Repairing flesh was futile when arteries and ligaments had been shredded into uneven fragments. The line between battlefield necessity and medical futility was drawn into stark relief. Officers emphasized the weapon's effectiveness in halting charges. Medical personnel recoiled at the futility of their work when confronted with mangled limbs. The tension stood as a reminder that the same design praised in tactical terms could be condemned as barbaric in medical ones. Drawings and diagrams circulated in medical journals tried to capture the uniqueness of these wounds. Earlier illustrations of bullet injuries often resembled tidy punctures, clinical and manageable in appearance. With dum-dums, sketches showed gaping cavities, jagged edges, and missing sections of tissue. Observers remarked that exit wounds looked more like the result of explosive force than of a rifle bullet. To the eye of both soldier and surgeon, these were unmistakably different. Injuries that carried the impression of an intent to maim far beyond what was considered necessary in combat. For the wider army, such details were not abstract. Men in the line quickly realized what these new rounds meant for survival. A shot to the arm could result in amputation within days. A hit to the torso was nearly always fatal. The expanding bullets shifted perception of battle wounds from difficult to hopeless. This knowledge spread informally across units, reinforcing the dum-dum's notoriety as not simply a weapon of war, but a weapon of terror. At the same time, commanders viewed those very effects as vindication. The Standard Point 303 had too often passed through enemies without halting an assault. The dum-dum changed that equation. One shot could reliably drop an opponent, granting the tactical certainty they had demanded since the adoption of smokeless powder rifles. For them, the question seemed settled. The bullet achieved the job. But in hospitals and aid posts, where the injuries were opened and examined, the conclusion was starkly different. The technology was effective on the battlefield, but deeply troubling to those who had to face its consequences up close. For all its efficiency, the dum-dum forced a debate that went beyond military engineering. Was it acceptable to field a weapon so destructive that survival was often impossible even when the target had not been killed outright? Could one justify a round that so consistently produced amputations as its baseline medical outcome? These questions began as murmurs among surgeons and officers, but they grew louder as reports spread through newspapers and diplomatic channels. What had begun as a factory modification in colonial India now carried moral repercussions far outside the empire. Dum Dum's infamy did not come solely from colonial battlefields. It arose from a broader realization. In trying to solve a problem of combat effectiveness, the British Army had created a new kind of injury that struck many observers as excessive. To its users, the bullet restored confidence in their rifles. To its critics, it blurred the line between combat necessity and cruelty. That duality, military reassurance versus medical horror, gave the Dum Dum an extraordinary symbolic weight. It was not only a piece of ammunition. It became a test case for whether the pursuit of stopping power justified the cost in human suffering. By the end of the decade, this dispute was no longer confined to soldiers and doctors. Political leadership and international observers were taking notice. Reports of wounds from places like Omdurman bolstered a growing sense that the expanding bullet represented a departure from accepted limits of warfare. Debates began to move from regimental mess halls and medical journals into diplomatic chambers. And soon, the question would not only be what the Dum Dum did to the human body, but whether the world's leading powers were willing to accept such a weapon as compatible with the rules of civilized war. It was in that climate of concern, where battlefield necessity clashed with deepening unease, that governments prepared to meet face to face and draw the boundaries of acceptable violence. The Hague Convention, drawing the line. In 1899, representatives from the world's leading powers convened in The Hague, a Dutch city that was quickly becoming synonymous with international diplomacy. Their aim was not to debate loosely defined ideals, but to place distinct limits on how wars should be fought in an age of increasingly destructive weapons. Military innovation in the late 19th century had reshaped combat. Smokeless powder, repeating rifles, and improved artillery had made battle faster and deadlier, raising questions about whether any boundaries remained between acceptable military practice and outright cruelty. The Hague Peace Conference set out to mark those boundaries with new rules. Among the questions laid before the delegates was the status of expanding bullets, a subject that triggered sharp disagreement as soon as it appeared on the agenda. The British delegation carried the heaviest burden in this debate. Their army had officially fielded Dum Dum bullets in colonial campaigns and continued to regard them as indispensable. Military officers argued that enemies often advanced despite wounds from standard full metal jacket ammunition. To them, Dum Dums solved the problem of insufficient stopping power. They emphasized that these bullets were not explosive, but rather simple modifications necessary for survival in certain battle conditions. And so, in the ornate chambers of The Hague, British diplomats defended a weapon their soldiers already relied on. Across the table, other powers reacted with skepticism and outrage. Delegates from continental Europe referred to battlefield reports documenting shattered bones and massive tissue destruction. To them, these injuries exceeded what could be considered ordinary battlefield harm. They argued that such ammunition inflicted unnecessary suffering, a core standard that international law had already started to consider. Their position was clear. Expanding bullets went too far, weaponizing pain and mutilation rather than focusing on the act of neutralizing an enemy. This was not the first time that nations had attempted to regulate the effects of munitions. More than 3 decades earlier, the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration had outlawed explosive projectiles under 400 grams on the grounds that they caused excessive injuries without significantly impacting the outcome of battle.